taking your Bible and opening up to Acts 25, that's where we are this morning, Acts chapter 25. I appreciate each of you for being here this morning and look forward to our period of study as well as our worship services throughout the course of this day. We're in Acts 25 and we have just a few more chapters left in this book. Before long, we're going to be starting our brand new class on Sunday morning. And so please be sure to read about those in our bulletin. They'll be on our announcement slide here in a few minutes. They're also posted there in the foyer as well, all of our upcoming classes. We have about 3 or 4 classes that are going to be starting very soon, so please keep a look on those things. But right now we're in Acts 25. In Acts 25, Paul is before Festus. Paul's before Festus. Now for several chapters we've been looking at Paul having been arrested in the city of Jerusalem. And now all of those events that have happened and been produced as a result of that one event. Now Paul is still incarcerated in Caesarea. He's been there for 2 years. But something has happened now between chapter 24 and chapter 25. The governor, Felix, who was responsible for having Paul incarcerated there for those 2 years, has now been removed and replaced by this man named Festus. And so Festus, in Acts 25, Paul appears before Festus. Notice their introduction. This chapter picks up where the previous chapter left off. Paul is incarcerated again in Caesarea. He's been there for 2 years, following that hearing he had back in chapter 24 with Felix. Now you recall back in chapter 24, Felix understood that Paul was guilty, and yet he lacked a backbone. He refused to make a decision. He wanted to defer the matter. He deferred it for 2 entire years. Now, if you think back to last week's chapter, why is it that Felix kept Paul incarcerated for 2 years? What was he hoping Paul would try to do? Exactly, pay him some money, bribe him. And so he kept him there for crooked reasoning. And for 2 years, though Paul has been innocent, he's been bound, he's been incarcerated, even without charges. Well, eventually, at the end of chapter 24, Nero recalled Felix and replaced him with Festus. Now, not much is known about Festus outside of what is mentioned here in the book of Acts and the writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian. So not really much is known about him, but here in this chapter, he's going to do several things that have direct bearing on Paul eventually getting to Rome. So as Festus takes this new position, he not only inherits Felix's position, he inherits this 2-year-old case of Paul, the prisoner, who still has no charges. So just put yourself in Festus' shoes. That puts him in a very dangerous situation. If he chooses now to come in this situation and just release Paul, that's going to anger the Jews. The Jews want Paul killed. They want Paul put on trial and eventually killed. They're not be satisfied with him just being let go. And so, politically speaking, that's going to be a bad move for him. But if he keeps Paul incarcerated, still without official charges, what does it look like to have this Roman citizen incarcerated with no charges at all? So either way, it's a bad situation for Festus. Well, there's 3 basic things he does in this chapter that have bearing on Paul's situation and have bearing on God's providential plan to get Paul to Rome. Notice in verses 1 to 5, Festus visits Jerusalem. Festus visits Jerusalem. That's one of the first things he does once he is appointed to his new position. He leaves Caesarea and comes to visit the city of Jerusalem. Notice then, secondly, from verses 6 to 12, the second thing he does, Festus reopens the trial in Caesarea. He visits Jerusalem. They bring up Paul's situation, and so he chooses to reopen Paul's trial back in the city of Caesarea. Well, then a third thing happens in verses 13 to 27. Festus explains the case to Agrippa. At the end of this chapter, we're introduced to someone else. We had Felix. He's been removed now. Now we have Festus. But now we're introduced to this man named Agrippa. And Paul's going to appear before Agrippa in Acts 26. So Festus explains the case to Agrippa. He visits Jerusalem. He reopens the trial in Caesarea. And he explains the case to Agrippa. I think as you go throughout this chapter, you'll see that Festus is trying to handle the situation wisely, but he does not always do the right thing. He does not always act correctly, act uprightly. After all, most politicians are like Felix and like Festus. Oftentimes they know what's right, and yet they do something else to receive favor from the people. And that's exactly what this man does. So let's begin reading. Somebody read verses 1 to 3, and we'll begin looking at Roman numeral number 1, Festus visits Jerusalem. Somebody read verses 1 to 3.
Now these days, after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way.
All right, so Roman numeral number A there. Festus has a meeting with the Jewish leaders. Festus has a meeting with the Jewish leaders. After settling into his new residence, no doubt, in Caesarea, he's now been appointed by Nero to serve as the governor of this province. He's settling into his new position, his new residence in Caesarea. But now he makes this decision to go up. Notice that wording, go up. That's geographically up. Jerusalem was higher in elevation, so you'll always read about people going up to Jerusalem. He makes this decision to leave Caesarea and go up to Jerusalem to meet with the Jewish leaders and take an inventory of the affairs in the city of Jerusalem. This is a political move. He knows how important it is for him to get along with the Jewish leaders, and so he wastes no time going to Jerusalem to spend some time there with those Jewish leaders. After all, the Sanhedrin is there. We've seen the Sanhedrin several times in the book of Acts. And even their role in trying to get the Apostle Paul killed, they're in Jerusalem. And they had a full knowledge of the province, and he's going there to politically gain some insights about the situation he has now inherited. Well, as we see, the Jews waste no time in this meeting with Festus, bringing up their case against Paul. Verse 2 says that the chief priest and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. So they bring it up. They waste no time. Now think about that. That's 2 years at least. Paul's been away from them. 2 years at least. Paul's been incarcerated in Caesarea. They've been back in Jerusalem. But for 2 years, they've still been brewing about this situation. They've not let it go. They're still angry. The Word of God tells us to not let the sun go down on our what? Our anger. Not even let a night pass by. And they've allowed 2 years to pass by. And if you read Ephesians 4:26, the rest of that passage, the Bible says, let not the sun go down on your wrath and give no occasion or opportunity to the devil. Whenever you and I allow anger to brew in our heart and we allow days and even hours, but days and weeks and months, years go by, that allows Satan a great doorway into our life to work. And no doubt that's what's happening right here. They've allowed their hatred to keep on brewing for 2 years. And even now, as Festus comes on the scene for political reasons to meet with them, they waste no time bringing up this 2-year-old case. And notice how adamant they are. They're wanting him, Festus, to bring Paul to Jerusalem. They're wanting a change of venue. They're wanting Paul, the prisoner, who had been taken from Jerusalem back in chapter 23 to Caesarea. They want him now to be brought back to Jerusalem. And notice there, the ESV says in verse 2 that they urged him. The King James says they besought him. Those words come from a Greek word that denotes the idea of begging. They're literally begging Festus to bring Paul back to Jerusalem. Now, why are they begging him to bring him back to Jerusalem, according to verse 3? They want to kill him. They have this plan that while he's en route back to Jerusalem for this change of venue, we'll ambush him and we'll kill him. And so they're begging him over and over, continual pleading. That's the imagery there. But notice what happens. Somebody pick up in verse 4 and read through verse 5.
But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him.
All right, so point B, Festus invited them to come to Caesarea for an official hearing. Festus invited them to come to Caesarea for an official meeting. In essence, he says, no, we're not going to change this venue, but if you still have charges to bring against him, then you can come back with me. I'm going to soon leave and go back to Caesarea. You can come back with me. We'll have an official hearing again, and you can bring these charges against him if indeed he is guilty. Festus was not easily swayed by their efforts to persuade him. Festus was wise enough not to cooperate with this scheme that would have caused Paul to have been killed, no doubt, if he had. But God's providentially working in this situation and allowing Paul to stay in Caesarea and these accusers to come back with Festus, that gave really Festus a great opportunity. That gave Festus a chance to go back and be able to review the case, get more facts, and honor the Roman custom of allowing the accused to answer his accusers face to face. Notice in verse 16. Verse 16 is, as the Bible talks about the events that are unfolding here, it says, I answered them that it was not the custom of the Jews to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. That's what Felix brings up later on. So right now he's honoring that custom. I'm not going to change this venue. He's not addressed you face to face yet before me. I'm going to let him have the opportunity. And so again, these 2 years, just realize from these first 5 verses, these Jews have not lost their anger. They've not lost their hatred for Paul. They're still wanting Paul killed. That's the first thing on their mind. They even have a plan to kill him. But Festus is not going to give in so easily to their schemes. Well, notice what happens beginning in verses 6 to 12. Roman numeral number 2, Festus reopens the trial in Caesarea. Already Paul has had to stand before people and defend himself. And now in Acts 25, it's going to happen again before Festus. There's going to be another trial, another hearing here in Caesarea. Somebody read verses 6 and 7. Notice how this hearing begins.
Now when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and made many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove.
All right. So there, point A, the Jews bring their charges. The Jews bring their charges. By the way, is anything said about a lawyer this go around? No. They had their legal expert, you recall, the last time there was a hearing. Back in chapter 24, they had Tertullus. They had that legal expert that they brought. Well, that didn't work. And now, as Festus says, come back with me if you have charges. And you can lay out these charges in an official hearing. They don't bring their legal expert. It's just them this time. But they do bring some serious charges. So the Jews bring their charges. After 8 to 10 days, Festus went back to Caesarea. And the day after he arrived, the courts convened, and the Jews the first to speak. The Bible says that they brought many serious charges against Paul. Notice the emphasis on many. They brought many serious charges. No doubt that was a tactic. That was a tactic to intimidate. Because none of those charges they could prove. Would it not be better to have one charge and a boatload of evidence versus maybe 10 or 20 charges with zero evidence? The efforts of just throwing out this charge and that charge and this charge and that charge, that's trying to intimidate, trying to bully, trying to overwhelm the situation. But as we're going to see here, they had no ability to prove any of them. They were just throwing out charges. The grammatical structure there of those words suggests many accusations without strength. And so they're looking for quantity instead of quality. They think the more charges they can hurl at him, the stronger their case will be, but they can't prove any of them. Isn't that what happened last time, back in Acts 24, 2 years ago? They brought some serious charges. That orator, that lawyer, just laid them out in the most eloquent way possible. There was no proof. I mean, it sounded good, but there was no real substantial proof for it. So notice verses 8 to 12. Somebody pick up there and read those passages.
While they answered, Philip said, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar, and I offended any of the law. But Festus wanted to be accused of favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So Paul said, I stand to Caesar's judgment seat, for I ought to be judged. Still you that have done no wrong, as you very well know. For I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death. I do not object to dying, to the effect there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus, when he had confirmed with the council, we have appealed to Caesar, to Caesar he so does.
All right, so point B, Paul appeals to Caesar. Paul appeals to Caesar. The trial has been reopened in Caesarea. The Jews are the first to speak. They bring their charges, many serious charges. Their focus is on quantity instead of quality. They can't prove a single one of them. And now Paul, as that Roman custom allowed, is able to address those charges face to face with his accusers. And that's what he does. Well, he's interrupted here, as you'll see, and as you've already seen, by Festus. And then following that, he appeals to Caesar. Let's think about those things. Paul begins his defense. And in his defense, he really answers those indictments one by one. He just goes down the list and just answers those indictments one by one. He brings up there how he is not been going around disputing the importance of the law of Moses. The law of Moses did play a significant role in God's plan while it was a binding law. So he's not been downplaying that or disregarding that. He has also not done what to the temple that they were accusing him of? You recall they made that accusation, he brought a Gentile to the temple and therefore did what to the temple? What is it? Defiled it, that's right. He says, I've not defiled, I've not desecrated your temple by bringing a Gentile in. What have they been accusing Paul of doing in the city? What has he been accused of leading in the city? What's that? Chaos, confusion, a riot, disorder. He says, I've not been doing that. So just one by one, he goes down the line and just says, I've not been doing these things. And despite all of these charges, they cannot prove a single one of them. So despite the lack of evidence on the part of the Jews, they have all those accusations, but Festus can see they're offering no proof. Coupled with that, Festus has now seen Paul answer each of those arguments in an indisputable way. Despite all of that, again, Festus is a typical politician. And he wanted to make the Jews happy. And so, notice what happens in verse 9. But Festus, despite the evidence, despite what's happened before his eyes, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? He's asking him, do you want to change a venue? After he's allowed the Jews the opportunity to bring their charges and Paul to address him face to face, he says, I'll give the Jews what they want if you agree to it, Paul. We can go back to Jerusalem and you can be tried there on these same charges. Notice in verse 9, don't miss what he's saying. He says, to be tried before me. Before me. By saying that, he's in essence promising Paul a fair trial. If you go to Jerusalem, if you change venues to Jerusalem, I promise it'll be before me. It'll be a fair trial. Well, how could it be fair if he's already heard the evidence, heard all the arguments, and refused to make the right decision? How could it be fair? He's already made a bad decision. He's already been unfair towards Paul. It's already unjust. But Paul knows that that is not God's will to go back to Jerusalem. He knows that's going to be a death sentence for him to go back to Jerusalem. And he does something, politically speaking, that is wise and also in accordance with God's ultimate will. It was a right. He has a Roman citizen, and he used his right for the benefit of his own life and God's will. He appeals to Caesar. No, I'm not going to go back to Jerusalem. You've heard the evidence. You've seen my case. I appeal to Caesar. I appeal this. Paul boldly addresses Festus and argues that as a Roman citizen, he should be tried before Caesar. Tried before Caesar's judgment seat. The Jews, after all, should have nothing to do with this because he's done them no wrong. There were two basic kinds of appeals to Caesar. One is called, I can't pronounce the Italian words, I'm not going to try to even do that, but one appeal, which is the kind of appeal that Paul is using right here, was the kind where they would appeal directly to Caesar himself once they were initially accused. That's the kind of appeal that he's having. The second came around the 2nd century, so after Paul's time, and it was once there were charges, once the judge had already decided on the matter, in essence it's already been heard before a judge and decided upon, then they would appeal to Caesar. But Paul right now is using a legal means to benefit himself. It is not wrong for a Christian to use a legal system. There's a time and place for that. And Paul's right now using that for his benefit and God's, of course, ultimate will. Notice there in verse 12 how Festus responds. He says, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." Do you sense a bit of sarcasm in that? Well, you want that. Okay, you'll get it. This is, he's saying, you don't really know what you're asking. You want this, I'll give it to you. There's some sarcasm in that. Well, notice what happens next. The hearing has been had. Festus has heard the case and refused to make a right decision, just like Felix did back in chapter 24. He wants to put the thing off, wants to make the Jews happy. But someone comes to visit in the very next passage. Somebody pick up in verse 13 and read down to verse 22. And we're going to be introduced to Agrippa. All righty, Lamar.
Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived in Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charges laid against him. So when they came together, here I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal, and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I suppose. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead and whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa came to Festus. I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in.
All right. And notice there that point A, Agrippa and his sister. Agrippa and his sister came to Caesarea. After the hearing with Paul, and Paul's now made his appeal to Caesar. He's being detained still until that can happen. In the meantime, Agrippa and his sister come to visit. No doubt they're coming as high-ranking officials to come and welcome this new governor to his official post. There's political reasons behind all this. Let's think about for a few minutes who Agrippa and his sister Bernice were. This Agrippa here is also called Herod. He is Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa II. He is the son of Herod Agrippa I, who killed James. Think back in chapter 12. His father killed James. So James was the first apostle to be killed, and it was this man's daddy who did it. And now here he is about to hear the Apostle Paul. He was around 16 years old whenever God struck his father with those intestinal worms. You can think back to that situation. Now, there's a lot of similarities, by the way, between the two individuals, father and son. His father had this great pomp, this great circumstance, this great scene, thought he was a god and was just receiving the praise of men, and God struck him with intestinal worms and he died. A very violent, painful death. Well, this man was about 16 years old when that happened. When he was around 23 years old, he was granted some territories around Palestine, and Caesarea and Philippi became his headquarters. So that's Agrippa. It's a very violent family, the Herod family, a very violent, ungodly, wicked, profane people. Well, Bernice here is his sister. It's his sister. And so keep in mind, it's her daddy as well who killed James and that family of individuals who were opposing Christ and all those things. Now, according to Josephus, Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived close to the time of the first century. So right around that time, he wrote about these things. And according to Josephus, Agrippa and Bernice, though brother and sister, were in an incestuous relationship. So you think of that depravity. Here they are traveling together as a couple. They're in this incestuous relationship. And it's a very disturbing thing when you think about that. And yet that puts in great perspective the confidence of Paul to stand before these wicked, ungodly, profane people who are in this incestuous relationship, whose own father killed the first apostle. And Paul stands before them and preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're afraid to talk to our neighbor about Christ. And we're afraid to talk to our family about Christ. Wow. To me, that really put things in perspective whenever I read about that situation. There's a lot we could say about that relationship they had, but just putting that in perspective. After visiting with Festus for several days, Festus brings up this case with Paul. He's obviously concerned about what to do. He doesn't really know what to do. He's inherited this case. He had to deal with it. He didn't really want to deal with it. He tried to do what would make the Jews happy. It didn't work. And now Paul's appealed to Caesar. He doesn't really know what to do. And so he just lays out this case before Agrippa. Now you can imagine Agrippa. Agrippa wanting to hear from himself. And that's the imagery there in verse 23. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. The imagery there is that as Festus was describing this situation involving Paul the prisoner, Agrippa was listening. And the whole time he was just yearning eagerly to get a chance to hear it himself. I sure wish I could talk with this man. I sure wish I could hear this case myself. And Festus says, well, tomorrow your wish will be granted. Tomorrow your dream will come true. You'll have an opportunity to hear him. So what happens next? Somebody read verse 23 to verse 27 and notice how the situation unfolds. And will lead to next week's chapter 26.
And on the morrow when Agrippa was come, and Bernice went with great pomp and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, and Festus commanded all was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews that dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that they ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to the justice, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord, wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination hath I learned have somewhat to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not withal to signify the Christ that is with him.
Alright, so despite all these hearings, despite all this time incarcerated, Paul still does not have what? Charges against him. Very good. After all of this, there is still not an official charge. Whenever Felix heard, back in chapter 24 of the hearing, his conclusion was this is not a matter of legality, this is not a matter of crime, this is a matter of a religious dispute among yourselves. There's no official criminal charge or legal charge against him. In chapter 25, now 2 years later, Festus hears Paul's case again. And the same thing, it's just a religious dispute. There's no official criminal legal charges to be brought against him. He's now appealed to Caesar, so he must go to Caesar, but still no official charges. So in essence, this next day's meeting here with Agrippa and all these people is so Agrippa can hear this case and maybe help Festus write down some charges to send with Paul as he goes to Rome for his appeal to Caesar. But notice all this pomp and circumstance. Agrippa and Bernice come out and they're just dressed almost like this fantasy-like atmosphere, gold and jewels and expensive clothing. Does that not remind you back in chapter 12 of Herod, their father? And the people hearing Herod make that great talk and said, behold, it's not a man talking, it's a God talking. And Herod just loved that. And God struck him with those intestinal worms that moment in time. But now, all these years later, here we have their children, Agrippa and Bernice, doing the same thing. This time Paul is before them. And eventually Paul in chapter 26 is going to give his defense again before Agrippa. Notice how we're getting closer and closer and closer to Rome. That's God's will. It all began with Paul going into Jerusalem. Those Jews arrested him. The situation went back and forth with those Roman guards. They eventually took this matter to the governor's hands, sent him to Caesarea for Felix to handle the situation. For 2 years he spent in Caesarea. Now Felix is gone and Festus is there. He hears the case. Paul appeals to Caesar. He's going to go to Rome. But now he has to stand before Agrippa and give his defense once again. We have just a couple more chapters. Acts 26, Paul appeals before Agrippa. In Acts 27, Paul sets sail for Rome. Finally, he's heading to Rome. Well, what happens to that ship he's on? Who knows? It wrecks. And he has to spend some time on an island, the island of Malta. And eventually, chapter 28, he arrives in Rome, and the book of Acts comes to a close. The first 30 years of church history. We'll put a peg down. Next week, I will not be here. Next week, I'll be away in Greenville at the Walnut Street Church of Christ. They're having a family day and invited me to come speak that day. And so one of our missionaries will be here preaching all day. And then the next Sunday, I'll be gone. I hate to be gone 2 Sundays in a row, but that's the way it worked out with the scheduling. I'll be away the next Sunday in Laverne. They asked me to come. And one of our close friends, you all know him, Raymond Elliott, will be here speaking that Sunday. So you'll have some good preachers here in my absence, but I'll be back next Sunday night. Not next Sunday, but the next Sunday night. So we'll put a peg down right now. Appreciate you being here for our class this morning.